Somewhere in Vietnam right now, a van is moving through traffic. In the back, packed into rice sacks, are pangolins. You cannot hear them. Pangolins do not make much noise. They roll into a ball when frightened, a behavior so perfect against predators that evolution never needed to add a second defense. A pangolin rolled into a ball is armored by its own scales, almost impenetrable, almost invulnerable. The thing the pangolin's armor evolved to protect against is claws and teeth. It did not evolve to protect against a human being who simply picks up the ball, drops it into a sack, and loads it onto a truck. The pangolin is the most trafficked wild mammal on Earth. Not historically. Right now, today, an estimated 1 million pangolins were taken from the wild and trafficked in the decade between 2010 and 2020. The Wildlife Justice Commission calculated during their peak investigation period, 1 pangolin was being taken from the wild every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, around the clock, across the forests of Africa and Asia. An animal that has existed on Earth for 80 million years was being extracted and shipped toward a market in China or Vietnam that believed its scales could cure cancer. They cannot cure cancer. They are made of keratin, the same material as human fingernails. Eating pangolin scales is medically equivalent to eating your own nails. The science is unambiguous. The demand is not interested in the science, and the network serving that demand was, until very recently, responsible for half the illegal pangolin scale trade in the world. This is the story of how a small European charity, working with undercover operatives, fake buyers, a young Vietnamese woman willing to sit across a table from one of the world's most dangerous wildlife traffickers and keep her face neutral, dismantled it. To understand the scale of what was being dismantled, you need to understand what a pangolin is and what has happened to it. There are 8 species of pangolin, 4 in Africa. 4 in Asia, all 8 are on the IUCN Red List, the global inventory of threatened species. 3 of the 4 Asian species are critically endangered. The Sunda pangolin, the Chinese pangolin, the Philippine pangolin populations collapsed so severely across Southeast Asia that by the 2010s, traffickers had shifted their sourcing almost entirely to Africa, where population pressure was lower. Nigeria became the single largest export hub for pangolin scales globally, accounting for 55% of seizures between 2016 and 2019. Scales traveled from Nigeria to Vietnam, from Vietnam across the land border into China, or they moved through Singapore, through Hong Kong, in containers declared as plastic pellets, as frozen fish, as car parts, as steel coils. In April 2026, Indonesian authorities opened a cargo vessel officially carrying 2,735 tons of steel coils and found 26 packages of pangolin scales concealed inside. The vessel was Vietnamese. A Vietnamese national was arrested. The case is ongoing. This is the baseline, not an exceptional event. A routine operation in a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry that has been running for decades. At its center, 4 years, was a network of Vietnamese organized crime figures. The Wildlife Justice Commission identified and tracked across multiple continents. They gave the network leaders operational names. They called one of them Big Mac. The Wildlife Justice Commission is headquartered in The Hague. It is a small organization, by the standards of the global conservation world, not a government agency, not a major NGO with thousands of employees, not Interpol or the UN. It is an independent foundation that describes its mission as disrupting and dismantling organized crime networks engaged in wildlife trafficking. Its tools are intelligence-led investigation, undercover operatives, and the provision of evidence packages to law enforcement agencies capable of making arrests. In April 2018, the Commission launched Operation Pluto, a dedicated investigation into the organized trade in pangolins, with a focus on Vietnam and its connections to West Africa. The investigation ran for years. Undercover operatives built relationships with traders. They attended meetings. They sat in cafes. They watched containers. They mapped financial flows. They recorded conversations. They built the case piece by piece, not because they had the power to arrest anyone, but because they could hand the evidence to someone who did. In September 2018, the Commission provided intelligence to the Vietnamese environmental police that led to the seizure of 780 kilograms of pangolin scales in Hanoi, the equivalent of approximately 2,080. It was the first seizure of pangolin scales at that volume ever made by the Vietnamese environmental police. Outside a port, 1 significant broker was arrested. It was a start. The network did not stop. It adapted. The Commission kept watching. A young Vietnamese woman, identified in BBC reporting only as Van, not her real name, was working undercover against wildlife traffickers. She was sitting in a cafe in Vietnam, across a table from one of the country's main wildlife traders. The trader's name was recorded in the investigation as Benze. He was complaining that police had seized his stock the previous summer. He needed 20 tons of pangolin scales shipped to Vietnam. He said this to a woman who was, in the commission's phrasing, an intelligence asset. Someone willing to sit across from a criminal and keep her face neutral while extracting the information that would eventually be used to put him in a courtroom. The commission's investigators tracked Benz and his associates across multiple countries. They documented connections between Vietnamese crime figures and African sourcing networks. They followed the money. They built a picture of an organization that was not a loose collection of opportunistic poachers. It was a corporation, a vertically integrated criminal enterprise with sourcing operations in Nigeria and Mozambique, transit infrastructure in Vietnam, and established delivery routes into China. And then the traffickers made a mistake. In May 2023, Benz and the figure the commission called Big Mac flew to Lagos, Nigeria, to source more wildlife products. Big Mac was recorded in a video boasting that he could send a container from here. He did not know that. Surveillance teams had been following him since his arrival in the country. The Nigeria Customs Service moved in. Big Mac was seized in his hotel room with 2 mobile phones. On those phones were ledgers detailed records of every shipment, profit and loss, payments made, purposes, destinations, the kind of documentation that makes a prosecutor's work straightforward. The subsequent trial was the first prosecution of its kind in Nigeria. 4 accused, 3 Vietnamese nationals and 1 Guinean, were convicted. They were described in court documents as high-ranking members of a major organized crime group. High-ranking, in this context, meant that their removal was expected to affect the entire network, not just a local branch of it, the chief prosecutor told the BBC. The sentence imposed may not be appropriate considering the crimes committed. However, from an investigation point of view, the results have been groundbreaking. From a charity in The Hague, working with a young woman in a cafe in Vietnam, tracking criminal ledgers on seized phones in a Lagos hotel room, and a parallel operation in Vietnam. The Education for Nature Vietnam hotline, the only dedicated wildlife trafficking reporting hotline in the country, resulted in seizures of nearly 52,000 animals since 2021. A single hotline, one phone number that anyone could call, generating intelligence that fed into operations that removed animals from the supply chain at a rate that no government program had previously achieved. At Phumet National Park in northern Vietnam, a man named Tai Van Nguyen was running something different. Tai Van Nguyen founded Save Vietnam's Wildlife in 2014. By 2020, the organization had rescued 1,540 pangolins from the illegal wildlife trade. It established Vietnam's first NGO-managed anti-poaching unit. Since 2018, that unit has destroyed 9,701 animal traps, dismantled 775 illegal poaching camps, confiscated 78 guns, and arrested 558 people for poaching across 95,000 hectares of primary forest on patrol trips, lasting up to 6 days. Tai Van Nguyen wanted to understand the supply chain from the inside. He worked with former poachers to go into the forest and learn how pangolins were tracked and captured. He visited markets, restaurants, and traditional medicine practitioners to understand demand. He trained rangers not just in law enforcement but in animal identification, GPS skills, first aid, and basic survival. And he built a rehabilitation center at Cuc Phuong National Park, where rescued pangolins are treated sometimes for severe injuries, including amputated limbs from trap wounds and released back into protected forest. In 2021, Tai Van Nguyen won the Goldman Environmental Prize, known as the Green Nobel of Conservation. He was 37 years old. He was awarded the prize for rescuing over 1,500 pangolins, training the rangers who dismantled nearly 800 illegal camps, and reducing poaching in Phumet National Park by a documented, measurable margin. One man, one organization, a national park's worth of forest, and a pile of destroyed traps that represents, for each one, an animal that did not end up in a rice sack in a van on a Vietnamese highway. Here's what this story actually is, underneath the trafficking statistics, and the court proceedings, and the undercover operatives, and the confiscated phone ledgers. It is a story about the gap between what an animal is and what a market decides it is worth. A pangolin is a solitary, nocturnal, insectivorous mammal that has been eating ants and termites in the forests of Africa and Asia for 80 million years. It poses no threat to anything larger than a termite. It plays a significant ecological role. A single pangolin can consume 70 million insects per year. making it one of the most effective natural pest control organisms in its ecosystem. It rolls into a ball and hopes for the best when something frightens it. It is, by almost every measure, one of the most defenseless large mammals on Earth against a determined human being. What the market decided it was worth: the keratin in its scales, which is identical to human fingernails, sold in China at prices that make the trafficking industry worth billions of dollars per year. The gap between those two descriptions of the same animal, the ecological reality and the market fiction, is the space in which 1 million pangolins disappeared in a decade. There has not been a reported seizure of pangolin scales originating from Africa and destined for Asia in over 550 days. As of the most recent Wildlife Justice Commission update, 550 days, the longest such gap in the documented history of the trade. The Commission attributes it directly to the disruption of the specific networks that Operation Pluto targeted. The trade is not ended. The pressure continues. In April 2026, pangolin scales were found in a Vietnamese-flagged vessel in Indonesia. The network adapts. It always adapts. But 550 days without a major seizure. From an industry running at 1 pangolin every 5 minutes. That is what one small charity in The Hague, one young woman in a cafe in Hanoi, one man with a Goldman Prize and a destroyed camp tally, and one team of anti-poaching rangers in Phu Mat National Park produced. The pangolin in the back of the van does not know about Operation Pluto. It does not know about the trial in Lagos, or the ledgers on the phone, or the 550-day gap in the supply chain, or the Goldman Prize, or the 9,701 destroyed traps. It knows it is in a sack. It knows it is frightened. It is rolled into a ball, doing the only thing its 80 million years of evolution gave it to do against this specific threat. It is not enough. It was never designed to be enough against this. What the evidence of the last decade confirms is enough in combination. Deployed with patience and intelligence and personal courage is the human beings who decided that the gap between what a pangolin is and what a market says it is worth is a gap worth their entire lives to close. If this story changed how you see a number you might have scrolled past before, 1 pangolin every 5 minutes, share it. Because the pangolin cannot share it, it is in a ball. But the people fighting for it can use every pair of eyes that knows the story.